Hey everybody, Bill Grismore here with 27 Virtual. Welcome. We're going to be taking a look at NSX Installation in this video. So in this video, we're going to take a 100 level look at how to actually get NSX installed. Also, make sure you go back and take a look at the previous video where we actually kind of covered, some of the basic prerequisites to getting NSX installed. For example, we should be at least on vSphere 5.5, vCenter 5.5. We should have virtual distributed switches in our environment. We should have, of course, our NSX licensing. We need to think about the type of network adapters we're going to have. And of course, we need to have the MTU size set to a minimum of 1600 across our physical environment. Something that we didn't talk about in the prerequisites are, the type of ports that have to be open if you have a physical firewall protecting your backend management network. Those type of things we can always look up in the actual documentation. So, the goal of these videos is to really just give you a high-level view of what's actually going on with the installation of NSX. So we'll take it from there. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Number one thing we have to do is we have to download the actual bits for the NSX manager. So once you have your deal registered and you've actually got your NSX license keys from your partner, you're going to log into My VMware and download the NSX OVA files that you need. So if you've ever done vShield deployments in the past, you may be familiar with it. It's a pretty simple download of an OVA file. If you have no vShield experience, you don't worry about it, not a requirement. But you're going to download the OVA, and to get an OVA installed, you have to go into vCenter, either the FAT client or the web client. You have to import the OVA from a data store. We have to actually bring that guy up. We have to give it an IP address, a mask, and a gateway. We have to tell it what data store to store it, the actual OVA on. Now, in this part of the deployment of the OVA itself, is before we actually configure the NSX manager. So we have to deploy the OVA and we have to make sure we put it in the right cluster. So here we have a management edge cluster. So our NSX OVA file is going to be placed in that cluster. Of course, we have a data store out here somewhere. We'd pick the proper data store to actually store it on. And we might have a folder that we're going to put it in. Basic VM stuff, like what cluster is it in? What folder do we put it in? What data store? Those type of things. Once we get past that and we get the OVA up and running, then we can actually access the NSX Manager web front end. It's got its own built-in web client. So let's say that we're using a management desktop and we're using it to manage vCenter. Once we get that OVA deployed, let me turn off that and that. Give me just 1 second here. Once we get this OVA deployed, we can now just go ahead and just log into this OVA and use the actual web front end on the NSX Manager itself and configure it to register with vCenter. So that would be the most important thing, is to get it registered. Now, there are some other things we have to do. We have to configure it to point to a time server. We have to configure it to point to a syslog server for logging. We need to configure DNS settings. Some basic things we have to do. Very, very basic standard IP stuff, right? But the most important thing we're going to do is once the OVA is deployed is register it with vCenter. Now, once we get it registered, we're going to come back over here. We're going to log out of this web client and we're going to log back in. When we log back in, it's going to install the network and security plugin in our browser. Now that takes about 4 minutes for that process to complete, more or less, right? Probably going to be using Chrome or Firefox most likely, and that'll get us kind of started with NSX. That's really your beginning point, because once you get that NSX plugin installed, that's where you actually go to do step number 2. So let me just label this step number 1, and I'm going to be very generic. So step number 1 includes everything: downloading the OVA, getting the OVA deployed itself, giving it IP mask gateway, registering it with vCenter, the whole 9 yards. We're just going to generalize things a little bit here. So that would be step number 1. Once all that is completed, from this plugin is where you're going to be doing the rest of your work here, right? So from this plugin, we're going to now go in there and we're going to deploy the NSX controllers. 1, 2, 3 NSX controllers, each one of them on a different host. Now, by default, there are no anti-affinity rules here in place. So on your cluster, we're going to take advantage of HA, make sure vSphere HA is set up and enabled. HA and DRS, but with DRS, we need to enable an anti-affinity rule. It will not create this anti-affinity rule for me by default. I have to actually specify that. So I can create an anti-affinity rule that would say, keep VMs separate. Something like that. And that way those VMs will never end up on the same host. Now, one other little tidbit you could do here is maybe you might want to consider, this is more of a design thing really, not part of an installation. You might want to consider actually having a fourth host. This way, if a host dies, we can make sure that this particular guy here comes up over here on this host. I mean, it's just an idea, right? Let me do it like this. If this guy dies, we want to make sure this guy comes up over here. Now, one thing that people always say to me whenever I mention this is, well, what if 2 hosts die? Well, if 2 hosts die, you're having a really bad day, right? But if you had a 4-node cluster and that's your management cluster and you've got NSX controllers deployed there, that way you get yourself some protection, some fault tolerance, right? Not a requirement to have 4 hosts. 3 would work, right? But that way, if you lose one, you still have the 3 controllers within 10 minutes or so. Now, the other thing that I want to do right here is give you a little tip. When you're deploying the controllers, do one at a time. Deploy one controller at a time and just wait for it. You'll see a green checkbox that says normal. Let it breathe for a minute. All right, and then come over, deploy the next controller. Takes a few minutes to deploy the controllers, 5-10 minutes each approximately. Could vary based on performance and system. Let it finish, get a green check that says normal. Same thing with the last controller. Do one controller at a time till they're all finished. Now, technically, you only have to deploy the first one, let it finish, and then do the next 2 simultaneously. And the reason we have to do the first one and let it finish is because there's an election that's going to take place. And if we start deploying multiple controllers at a time, there can be some confusion there about who becomes the master. So to be 100% sure it goes smoothly, at the very, very least, deploy one controller, let it finish, and then deploy the next 2. It's my personal recommendation to deploy one at a time and let them completely finish. Okay? Not a requirement, just something to keep in mind. Also, there's going to be a IP pool that you're going to have to set up here that has the IP addresses in it that are going to be used by these guys. Or you're going to leverage a DHCP server. Probably in most cases, you're just going to build a little IP pool, and then when they get deployed, they actually pull their IP address information from that pool. Another thing to make note of here is that these NSX controllers are not sitting on a VXLAN at all, right? They're just sitting on the same network as vCenter. They're sitting on the same network as the NSX manager. So there's just a regular kind of a backbone core management network, if you will, that everything just plugs into here. vCenter plugs into it, NSX manager plugs into it, and all the controllers plug into it as well. They're all sitting on the same network, right? And then this is the same network that will connect to the management port on all of your hosts, right? Now, this management network might be routed. In this case, I have layer 3 boundaries, but nevertheless, all those green lines are the management network. It's a regular VLAN back management network. It is not VXLAN, okay? So deploying the controllers, we're going to label that as step number 2. Step number 2, we are deploying the controllers. Step number 3, we're going to do the host prep. Host prep is pretty easy. The host prep is just putting the bits in the kernel. Again, this is all being done from the NSX plugin over here. And we're going to deploy the route, switch, and distributed firewall VIBs, vendor infrastructure bundles, or bits into the hosts. We also deploy something called a switch security module that helps with ARP snooping and DHCP snooping. So we'll just say we do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And now this is all done at the cluster level. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So the host prep is actually within this NSX plugin is done cluster by cluster by cluster. It's a cluster thing, not a host thing. So really what's going to happen is vCenter is actually doing the updating. He's just pointing to a URL back on the NSX Manager that contains the files to update the host. And then the vCenter and something called the ESX Agency Manager is the one that's actually doing the updating. And it's all done at a cluster level, just like we do with any kind of third-party vendor type of addition. If you've ever done, again, vShield, I keep going back to that, but it's kind of like a vShield type of deployment. Almost think of the NSX deployment as like you're installing a third-party something into your vSphere environment, because that's basically the way it treats it. All right. Oh, good news, no host reboot is required. And then the last step, very similar, it's going to be done by cluster, is the VXLAN prep. Now for the VXLAN prep, you're going to need, in this example, an IP pool for each cluster because there's a layer 3 boundary between each one. So we're going to do a VXLAN prep for this cluster. We'll create another IP pool for the next cluster. So you'd have to be careful here because we have 3 different layer 3 boundaries, or we have 3 different network segments, I should say. And we're going to be doing a prep by cluster. Now, if 2 clusters span one boundary, it is possible that one IP pool could be used twice. I'll see if I can depict that here in a second. We'll do one other IP pool. That would be the only real warning I have here. It could be a little bit confusing. So in this example, every single cluster is on a different network segment, right? But what if I were to change this where, let's say this is just one switch right here, and all these hosts are plugged into the one switch, something like this. Then I would only be using one IP pool, but I would reuse the same IP pool twice. I would just have to make sure that the range of the pool is big enough to support both clusters. So IP pool A would be used both on cluster A and cluster B because they're both on the same layer 2 segment. So in this case, I would have 2 IP pools. Let me label the IP pool green B here, just to make the point. IP pool B. So I have IP pool A in purple, and I have IP pool B in green. And what I would be doing here is using IP pool B once on the management cluster because it's just one segment. And the way I modified the drawing here, I would be using IP pool A to prep cluster A. And I would also be using IP pool A to prep cluster B because it's part of the same layer 2 segment. So there you go. Those are the steps that you would use to actually install NSX. It's a high-level overview. We're not getting into every single nitty-gritty detail, right? But number 1, deploy the NSX Manager, register it with vCenter, deploy the controllers one at a time, let them breathe a little bit between each installation. Think about your vSphere HA and DRS settings. Number 3, you do your host prep. Good news is you don't have to reboot. Now in newer versions, once you get to 6.3 and above, you can do the installation and you don't have to reboot. You can also do updates and removal and not have to reboot. They've kind of separated the code out into 6.3 and above. And then the last step is do the VXLAN prep, right? When you do the VXLAN prep, that's when you're going to get the actual VTEP on every single host, right? And the VTEP will be set to an MTU of 1600. So you're going to get a brand new, I'll just put a V on each host, right? You're going to get a VTEP VM kernel NIC for VXLAN on every single host, and your MTU will be set to 1600 on the VTEP, and you're going to raise the MTU to 1600 across your virtual distributed switches, and that all happens automatically. Remember, you still have to go to the physical layer and raise your MTU to a minimum of 1600. All right, so there you have it. There's an overview of the NSX installation process. I hope you found that video informative. Thank you very much, and we'll see you guys in the next video.